Hey everyone, it's Danny. Got some themes to cover, so some next videos you're gonna be hearing a lot from me. Get set and buckle up. Today's video is gonna be spicy and packed with unexpected interesting historical facts, of course. The Spartan machine, how ancient Greece's most feared warriors were manufactured. For most of us, sex is driven by desire, connection, and love. For the Spartans, it was none of those things. It was a command, a biological duty enforced by the state for one single mission: to forge the deadliest human weapons the ancient world would ever face. Spartans weren't raised as people. They were built as soldiers, and their creation didn't start on the battlefield. It began in the bedroom. Forget the myth of the red cloaks and noble speeches. Behind the legend of the 300 lies a disturbing truth. A cold system of human engineering so severe it makes the darkest dystopias seem almost merciful. This wasn't just a military society. It was a eugenic machine, a factory designed with ruthless precision to manufacture superior warriors through controlled breeding, brutal selection, and psychological conditioning that would break and remake human beings from birth to death. By the end of this journey, you'll understand how Sparta created warriors so feared that enemies surrendered at the sight of their red cloaks, why their own mothers would kill sons who showed cowardice, and how the very perfection they sought became the poison that destroyed them. This is the story of what happens when a society sacrifices everything human on the altar of military excellence. This is the story of Sparta. Hey, before we get into it, quick thing. If you're into ancient history, brutal realities of warrior cultures, and the chilling genius of a society that sculpted perfection out of suffering and obedience, hit that like and subscribe. I love seeing where everyone's watching from. Drop your city and what time it is in the comments. It's crazy to think some of you might be catching this at sunrise in Athens while I'm editing it past midnight. Anyway, get comfortable. This one's intense. Adjust those pillows, dim the lights, and let's step into the world that turned human beings into living weapons. The breeding program. At the core of this machine was absolute state control over reproduction. In Sparta, personal choice meant nothing when it came to love or family. The government acted as the only matchmaker, pairing citizens based on strength, not sentiment. Old magistrates, men hardened by decades of war, examined young males like livestock, judging height, stamina, and lineage. He was the tall, broad-shouldered warrior born of decorated ancestors. She was the strong, fertile woman with wide hips and a sturdy frame. Beauty mattered not for vanity, but as a signal of good health, of better blood. Marriages were state-arranged, cold, strategic unions meant to produce superior offspring. Love was irrelevant. Desire was optional. The body no longer belonged to the individual. It belonged to Sparta. Every citizen's duty was to strengthen the state through their bloodline. This wasn't about happiness. It was about optimization, about breeding the next generation of weapons. The Spartan state carefully monitored bloodlines with bureaucratic precision. Detailed records were kept of family military achievements, physical characteristics, and breeding outcomes. Men who demonstrated cowardice in battle, those who threw away their shields to flee faster, who broke formation, who abandoned their post, were completely forbidden to marry, effectively removed from the gene pool. They were socially marked as tresantes, tremblers. Forced to wear patches on their clothing, forbidden to trim their beards in the Spartan fashion, and excluded from communal exercises and meals. This public humiliation served a dual purpose. It punished cowardice and ensured that a coward's genes would not pollute the next generation of warriors. The most distinguished Spartans were actively encouraged to have multiple children, sometimes with multiple women. King Anaxandridas Roman II was ordered by the ephors to take a second wife when his first proved barren, not for his happiness, but for the state's genetic interests. The legendary lawgiver Lycurgus himself was said to have promoted a system where older men with young wives could invite younger, more vigorous men to father children with them, creating what they believed would be superior offspring. This wasn't scandal. It was policy, written into their laws and defended by their philosophers. women's roles were twisted into something unfamiliar compared to the rest of Greece. Unlike in Athens, where women were cloistered inside homes, rarely seen in public, managing only domestic affairs, Spartan women moved freely through their city. They owned property, eventually controlling 2/5 of all Spartan land. They managed estates while their husbands lived in barracks. They were educated, literate, and politically aware, though barred from holding office themselves. But this freedom had a price. They were vessels of the Spartan nation first, individuals second. Girls trained not for combat but for childbirth's battlefield. They ran races at the festival of the Heraean Games. They wrestled and competed publicly, often in minimal clothing that scandalized other Greeks. They threw javelins, lifted weights, practiced gymnastics, all to condition their bodies to carry warriors. The Spartan poet Tatius wrote that the greatest glory for a woman was to bear sons who would die gloriously for Sparta. Their worth was measured in the quality of children they produced, their legacy written in the blood of sons who never came home. But the system's most disturbing feature was the practice of wife-sharing for eugenic purposes. When a warrior's wife couldn't conceive, when she produced weak or sickly children, when another man's wife showed exceptional health and vigor, Sparta had a solution. A strong warrior could father a child with another man's wife with both husbands' knowledge and approval. The resulting child belonged to the household, not the biological father, but everyone knew the real purpose: genetic optimization. Plutarch records a conversation between a Spartan woman and an Athenian woman. The Athenian asked why Spartan women were the only Greek women who ruled over their men. The Spartan replied, "Because we are the only ones who give birth to men." It was both boast and truth. They were engineered to produce warriors, celebrated for it, and knew no other purpose. The Spartan wedding ritual itself revealed the transactional nature of reproduction. There was no dowry negotiation, no joining of two families in public celebration, no elaborate sacrifice to Hera, goddess of marriage. Instead, the groom literally kidnapped the bride in a ritualistic reenactment called marriage by capture. The bride, often around 18, far older than the 12 or 13-year-old brides common in Athens, had her head shaved completely, removing all feminine appearance. She was dressed in men's clothing and sandals, left alone in a dark room on a bed of reeds. The groom would sneak in after dark, having left his communal meal early. He would quickly consummate the marriage, then return to the barracks before dawn to sleep among his fellow soldiers. This wasn't a one-time ritual. It continued for years. Even after formal marriage, Spartan men did not establish households with their wives until age 30. They visited secretly at night for procreation, then vanished before sunrise. Some men, Plutarch claims, fathered several children before ever seeing their wives in daylight. The purpose was calculated: minimize emotional bonds that could weaken a warrior's loyalty to the state and his comrades. A wife was deliberately kept as a stranger, glimpsed only in darkness, known only through physical duty. Love, if it developed, was accidental and discouraged. The true family was the military unit, the brothers who trained together, ate together, fought together, and died together. The state punished those who refused to marry or reproduce with systematic public humiliation. Bachelors beyond age 30 were branded agonoi, childless ones, and treated as civic failures. During the winter festival of the Gymnopaedia, these men were forced to parade naked through the frozen agora while married women pelted them with insults and occasionally stones. They sang self-mocking songs composed for the occasion, admitting their failure to serve Sparta. In old age, they were denied the honors and respect automatically granted to fathers of soldiers. Young people were not required to stand when they entered a room. They received no help in times of need. The message was clear: your body belongs to Sparta, and refusing to use it for the state's purposes makes you worse than worthless. It makes you a traitor. The cost of this ideology was immense. Compassion faded from daily life. Generation after generation was conditioned to believe tenderness was weakness, that one's body belonged not to the self but to the state, and that parenthood was not love but service. Children didn't learn affection from their parents. They learned obedience from their trainers. Mothers handed their sons to the state at 7, whispering only, "Return with your shield or on it." That phrase wasn't empty pride. It was the end point of a culture that had erased maternal love and replaced it with fanatic devotion to Sparta's glory. When a Spartan child was finally born, it wasn't a time of celebration. It was a test. The newborn wasn't placed in its mother's arms first. By law, it was taken directly to a grim place called the Lesh, the Gathering Hall. There, the Gerousia awaited the council of 28 elders plus the 2 kings. These men, all over 60 years old, had survived the Agoge countless battles, decades of Spartan life. They had witnessed death in every form and looked at life through its lens. Naked and trembling, the baby was inspected with clinical detachment. The elders examined bone structure, looking for signs of skeletal deformities. They checked the spine for curvature, the legs for proper formation, the chest for adequate size. They observed the infant's movements, looking for palsy or seizures. They listened to the cry. A weak wail could indicate constitutional frailty. Ancient sources suggest that babies were bathed in wine instead of water, a practice they believed would reveal hidden weaknesses, though it likely caused reactions in vulnerable infants that the examiners interpreted as proof of their unfitness. The examination followed standardized criteria passed down through generations. A clubfoot might be acceptable if mild, but severe cases meant rejection. A cleft palate was an automatic death sentence. Such a child could not eat properly and would burden the state. Blindness, deafness, any obvious deformity, all condemned the infant. Even cosmetic issues that suggested genetic problems could doom a child. The examiners weren't being cruel by their own logic. They were being practical. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake from their perspective. To Spartan thinking, it was survival mathematics. They were a warrior caste of perhaps 8 to 10,000 full citizens surrounded by helots who outnumbered them 7 or 10 to 1, plus hostile neighbors in every direction. In such a world, every mouth to feed had to also be a weapon to wield. A frail infant wasn't just unable to contribute, he would consume resources while contributing nothing to defense. Worse, if weakness was hereditary, his descendants might spread that weakness through the gene pool. Mercy today could mean genetic pollution tomorrow. Sparta's creed was survival through strength. No exceptions, the council's decision was final. There was no appeal, no second opinion, no mother's plea that could overturn it. If the baby passed inspection, he was returned to his family, but not as a son belonging to his parents. He was officially property of the state, assigned one of the 9,000 plots of land allocated to Spartan citizens, recorded in the citizen rolls, already marked as a future member of a specific military company. His life's path was traced before he could walk. But if the elders' judgment turned against him, if they ruled he was unfit to live as a Spartan, he wasn't executed by sword or drowned quickly in a river. His end came in a way the Spartans considered more natural. The infant was carried by an appointed state official to the barren slopes of Mount Taygetus, to a place called the Apotheti, the deposits. There, at a chasm called Kyatas, surrounded by cliffs and without shelter, the newborn was left exposed to the elements. To Spartan logic, this was not murder in the legal or religious sense. They believed they were returning to nature what nature had produced imperfectly, allowing the gods and the wilderness to take back what had been incorrectly formed. The infant might die from exposure, from dehydration, from the cold nights, or from wild animals. The method was deliberately passive. The state did not kill, it merely withdrew protection. This philosophical distinction mattered enormously to them, allowing them to avoid blood guilt while achieving the same end. Modern archaeological excavations on Mount Taygetus have yielded evidence consistent with this practice. In the 1990s, excavations at the suspected site of the Apotheti discovered human remains, including those of infants and young children, along with adult remains dating to the classical period. Analysis suggested death by exposure and trauma consistent with falls. The deposits also contained bones showing signs of deformities and disease. The physical evidence confirms what the ancient sources described: though the exact scale and consistency of the practice remains debated among historians. Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, but drawing on earlier sources including Aristotle's lost constitution of the Lacedaemonians, described the process in clinical detail. He notes that the elders' examination was thorough, that strong and well-formed children were officially enrolled and assigned land, while weak or deformed children were sent to the apotheke. He adds that the Spartans considered it beneficial neither to the child nor to the city for someone not naturally constituted for health and strength to live. Passing the elders' inspection was only surviving the first gate. From that moment, the child's life became a carefully controlled process with predetermined checkpoints, each designed to filter out weakness and forge strength. The next 18 years would test whether the elders' initial judgment had been correct. Childhood, the first 7 years. Those who survived the initial inspection faced a childhood radically different from other Greek children. Until age 7, boys remained with their mothers, but even these early years were marked by state-mandated conditioning. Spartan mothers received explicit instructions on child-rearing that contradicted maternal instinct at every turn. Babies were not rocked when they cried at night. The infant was left alone in his crib in darkness to cry himself into exhaustion. The belief was that this taught self-reliance and courage from the earliest age. Crying brought no comfort, darkness no rescue. The child learned that the world would not bend to his distress. Plutarch notes that Spartan babies were famous throughout Greece for not crying, a trait so notable that wealthy families in other cities would hire Spartan nurses for their own children, paying premium prices for women trained in Spartan child-rearing methods. The children were deliberately exposed to discomfort to build tolerance. They were underdressed for cold weather, overdressed for heat, taught to ignore bodily discomfort. They were fed bland, simple food with no variation to build what the Spartans called good habit. The ability to eat whatever was available without complaint. Picky eating was beaten out of children before they could walk. Food was sustenance, nothing more, and a warrior who required specific foods or preparations was worthless in campaign. From the earliest age, boys were encouraged toward violence and competition. Rough play was celebrated, gentleness discouraged. When 2 toddlers fought over a toy, mothers did not intervene to teach sharing, they watched to see which child would dominate, which would submit. The winner was praised, the loser shamed. Aggression was a virtue. Cooperation meant nothing if it came from weakness rather than strength. Spartan children were also notably not taught to fear supernatural threats the way other Greek children were. There were no stories of monsters to enforce bedtime, no bogeymen to threaten misbehavior. Instead, children were taught that the only things worth fearing were dishonor and failure. A Spartan mother would not threaten her misbehaving son with punishment. She would threaten him with the shame he would bring upon his future comrades when his weakness was revealed. These early years were not about nurturing in the conventional sense. They were about the first phase of hardening, of building tolerance to discomfort and fear. The child learned early that crying brought no comfort, that darkness was not to be feared but endured, that pain was temporary but shame was permanent. Even maternal love, and there is evidence that Spartan mothers did love their sons, was filtered through the lens of state duty. The mother knew that in a few short years, her son would be taken from her permanently, and she prepared him for that separation by maintaining emotional distance even as she raised him. Interestingly, girls during these early years were not segregated from boys as they were in most of Greece. Both played together, both were exposed to similar physical conditioning, both learned the basic values of Spartan society. This early gender integration was unusual in the ancient world and served a purpose. Spartan women needed to understand warrior culture intimately to fulfill their role as mothers of warriors. They couldn't venerate what they didn't understand, couldn't properly shame cowardice if they didn't comprehend courage, couldn't raise proper sons if they themselves had been raised in feminine seclusion. The Agoge, manufacturing warriors. At age 7 came the rupture that defined every Spartan's life. Picture the scene. A boy, still young enough that his voice hasn't changed, still dependent on his mother for comfort and care, is taken from his home. His mother doesn't weep. She cannot show that weakness. She simply hands him over to the state official who has come to collect him. There is no farewell embrace, no promise of visits, no pretense that this is temporary. From this moment forward, the boy belongs to Sparta. His mother is forbidden to show sorrow at his leaving. To do so would be to suggest that her love for her individual son outweighs her loyalty to the state, a sentiment close to treason. The Agoge was mandatory for all Spartan citizens. There were no exceptions, no exemptions for aristocratic families or special circumstances. Even royal princes entered the Agoge at 7 and endured the same trials as every other boy. This egalitarianism was central to Spartan ideology. In the Agoge, all were equal in suffering, united by shared hardship. A future king slept on the same reed mat, ate the same insufficient rations, endured the same beatings as the son of the poorest Spartiate. Boys were organized into groups called ageli, literally herds, a term usually used for animals, revealing how Spartans viewed this process. Each agela contained boys of similar ages under the command of a paidonomos, an adult official whose sole responsibility was overseeing military education. The paidonomos answered directly to the state, not to the boys' families. He was judge, disciplinarian, and commander with absolute authority over his charges. The boys lived in communal barracks called skana, crude wooden buildings deliberately kept uncomfortable. There was no privacy, no personal space, no individual possessions. Everything was shared, everything was communal. This forced collectivism was intentional, individuality was dangerous, privacy bred secrets, personal possessions encouraged selfishness. The Agoge existed to destroy the individual and forge him into an interchangeable part of the greater whole. Lesson 1. Deprivation and theft. The first lesson of the Agoge was that comfort is the enemy. The Spartan boy slept on a bed he made himself from reeds torn by hand, never cut with a knife from the banks of the Eurotas River. The reeds were prickly, uncomfortable, and needed frequent replacement as they dried and broke. This taught resourcefulness and guaranteed that sleep was never truly restful. The beds were deliberately inadequate, clothing was minimal and unchanging. A single rough tunic called a tribon, the same garment for burning summer and freezing winter. Hot baths were forbidden as a luxury that weakened the body. The boys bathed in the cold Eurotas River regardless of season, a practice that killed the weak through hypothermia and hardened the strong. They went barefoot year-round, developing calluses that eventually became thick as leather. Their hair was cropped short, their appearance kept deliberately shabby. Above all, they were kept hungry. The state-provided rations were carefully calculated to be insufficient enough to prevent starvation, not enough to satisfy. A Spartan boy lived in a state of constant, gnawing hunger that dominated his thoughts and drove his actions. This wasn't accidental cruelty, it was calculated preparation. The boys were explicitly encouraged, indeed required, to steal food to make up the difference. Theft was not merely permitted, it was a mandatory part of the curriculum. The city became their training ground. They would slip out of the barracks at night, moving through Sparta like shadows, stealing from homes, markets, temples, anywhere they could find food. Some boys developed elaborate networks of informants, learning which households had food deliveries on which days, which guards were lazy, which merchants were careless. This taught numerous military skills simultaneously. Stealth, obviously, moving unseen through hostile territory. Planning and reconnaissance, scouting targets, timing, logistics. Leadership and cooperation, more complex thefts required teamwork and clear command structures. Resource management, stolen food had to be hidden and rationed among the agela. Risk assessment, weighing the value of a target against the danger of capture, but if caught, the punishment was severe and public. The boy would be brought before his agela and flogged mercilessly, not for the crime of theft itself, but for the crime of incompetence. Getting caught meant you failed. The distinction was crucial to Spartan morality. Success justified everything, failure excused nothing. On a real battlefield, being caught while infiltrating enemy lines meant death not just for you but potentially for your entire unit. The Agoge made sure that lesson was burned into flesh and memory. This created a peculiar moral framework where boys learned to lie, cheat, and steal with pride, as long as they did it well. They learned to betray merchants' trust, to exploit kindness, to treat every human interaction as a potential advantage to be seized. Traditional Greek values of xenia, guest friendship, and mutual respect meant nothing. The only virtue was effectiveness in service to Sparta. Lesson 2. The weapon of silence physical deprivation was only the beginning. The real transformation happened in the mind. The Spartans understood something profound. The body adapts to hardship quickly, but the mind is where true control must be established. Having conquered the body through hunger and cold, the instructors now targeted the soul. Their primary weapon was enforced silence and verbal combat. The word laconic, meaning brief in speech, comes directly from Laconia, Sparta's region. This linguistic legacy reflects how central controlled speech was to Spartan identity. Boys were taught that words were precious, dangerous tools to be used with precision. Idle chatter, unnecessary questions, emotional outbursts, all were punishable offenses. The training was ruthless. Instructors and older boys would hurl complex questions designed to have no right answer, only traps. Who is the bravest man in Sparta? If you named someone living, you insulted everyone else. If you named someone dead, you suggested current Spartans were inferior to their ancestors. Is it more honorable to die in victory or survive defeat? Either answer could be twisted into an admission of cowardice or recklessness. Would you steal from a fellow Spartan? Answer yes and admit criminality. Answer no and admit you lack cunning. Boys learned to answer in brief, sharp phrases that committed to nothing while appearing to commit to everything. They learned to turn questions back on questioners, to deflect through humor, to use silence itself as a weapon. The ability to maintain composure under verbal assault translated directly to maintaining composure under interrogation or psychological warfare in battle. Hesitation meant weakness. A boy who paused too long before answering would be struck, sometimes by the instructor, sometimes by an older boy acting on the instructor's nod. The punishment varied. A blow to the thumb was common, the pain sharp enough to be memorable but not disabling. Biting of the thumb, mentioned by Plutarch, left a mark that lasted days, a visible reminder of failure. The curriculum deliberately excluded what other Greeks considered education. There was no poetry beyond martial songs, no philosophy beyond tactical wisdom, no mathematics beyond what was needed for military formations, no art, no music except war chants. In Athens, boys studied Homer to learn about human nature and the gods. In Sparta, boys studied Homer only to learn how Achilles fought and why Hector's compassion for his family was a dangerous weakness. Reading and writing were taught, but only to the minimum level needed for military communications and recording orders. Intellectual curiosity was actively discouraged as a distraction from duty. A boy caught reading anything beyond military manuals would be mocked and beaten. The life of the mind was dangerous. It encouraged questions, doubts, individual thoughts that might conflict with orders. The Spartans coined their own word for this philosophy, eunomia, often translated as good order, but really meaning something deeper, a state where everyone knows their place, performs their function, and never questions the system. The Agoge existed to create eunomia in human form. Lesson 3. Institutionalized cruelty. The worst cruelty in the Agoge came not from adult instructors but from the boys' own peers, following a carefully designed hierarchy of power. Boys aged 14 to 19, called irens or hebonts, ruled over the younger boys with official state sanction. These young men had completed the initial hardening of the Agoge but weren't yet full citizens. They held power without full responsibility, a dangerous combination the state deliberately exploited. The irens were simultaneously the boys' commanders, teachers, jailers, and tormentors. They led the Ageli in training but also in fights, competitions, and the constant verbal sparring that dominated meals and free time. They had absolute authority to punish younger boys for any perceived failure, and their punishments were limited only by a single rule: don't kill or permanently disable. Everything else was permitted. Meals became battlegrounds of psychological warfare. The Irons would demand impossible choices. Who among you is the weakest? If a boy named someone else, he was a coward who betrayed his comrades. If he named himself, he admitted unworthiness and invited abuse. If he refused to answer, he showed defiance and would be beaten. There was no winning, only different ways of losing. This was the point: to create minds that could function under impossible conditions, that could make decisions when all choices were bad. This system created an environment of constant alertness and paranoia. Trust was impossible when anyone might be testing you, when friendship could be a trap, when kindness might be weakness to be exploited. Boys learned to sleep lightly, to hide their thoughts, to show no vulnerability. The strong learned to dominate without mercy. The weak learned to survive through cunning and obedience, but this wasn't random bullying allowed by negligent authorities. It was state policy, supervised and encouraged. The paidonomos would watch these interactions, noting which boys showed leadership in cruelty, which showed creativity in verbal combat, which showed resilience under humiliation. These observations determined future military assignments. A boy who dominated his peers might be marked for officer training. A boy who endured silently might be noted as reliable infantry material. A boy who crumbled under pressure might be assigned to support roles or, in extreme cases, denied full citizenship. The system also included formal fights called diamastagosis, ritual beatings that served both religious and educational purposes. During certain festivals, boys would be beaten with whips in front of the entire city. Judges watched to see who endured without crying out, who collapsed first, who showed fear. These public beatings were attended by families, with mothers and sisters watching to see if their boys proved worthy. The psychological impact of enduring torture while your mother watched without emotion cannot be overstated. It reinforced that even familial bonds were subordinate to proving one's worth to the state. The physical training alongside the psychological conditioning came relentless physical training. From the moment the Agoge began, boys spent hours daily in physical exercise. Running was constant. Boys ran everywhere, never walked, building endurance that would later allow Spartans to march faster and farther than any other Greek army. They ran in full armor to build strength. They ran in bare feet over rough ground to toughen their feet. They ran carrying each other to build both strength and teamwork. Wrestling was central to the curriculum, practiced daily and brutally. This wasn't sport wrestling with weight classes and rules. Boys wrestled until one submitted or couldn't continue. Broken bones were common, dislocations frequent. The Spartans believed wrestling taught essential military skills: grappling in close combat, understanding leverage and body mechanics, learning to use an opponent's strength against them, and above all, learning to endure pain without yielding. They practiced pankration, a brutal combat sport combining boxing, wrestling, and kicking. Almost anything was permitted except biting and eye gouging. Boys learned to break grips, escape holds, strike vital points. They developed pain tolerance that bordered on inhuman. Plutarch records boys who had their eyes gouged out by opponents and continued fighting, who broke arms and fought on with the remaining arm, who were strangled unconscious and upon waking, immediately resumed combat. Weapons training began early and was extensive. The dory, the 8-foot Spartan spear, was their primary weapon. Boys practiced thrusting in formation, maintaining spacing, coordinating with the shields of those beside them. The xiphos, a short sword, was for close combat when the spear line broke. They learned to use it efficiently in the press of bodies where there was no room for elaborate technique, only quick, lethal thrusts. Shield work was perhaps most important. The aspes, the heavy bronze-faced wooden shield, weighed about 30 pounds. Boys had to learn to carry it for hours without tiring, to maintain formation while handling its weight, to use it both defensively and offensively, blocking blows but also striking opponents with its edge. The shield's distinctive lambda symbol, marking them as Lacedaemonian was explained to them as representing not just their city but their commitment to return with it or on it. At age 12, the intensity increased dramatically. The single tunic was often removed entirely during training, and boys exercised naked regardless of weather. This hardened them to temperature extremes and, the Spartans believed, promoted proper masculine development. The removal of clothing also served a practical purpose. It prevented any boy from hiding weakness. A thin boy couldn't disguise his poor nutrition. A boy favoring an injury couldn't hide his limp. Everything was visible, everything was assessed. The pederastic system, one of the most controversial aspects of the Agoge, was the institutionalized pederastic relationships between boys and older warriors. Each adolescent boy was assigned an older male mentor, typically a Spartan in his early 20s who had completed the Agoge but not yet reached full citizenship at 30. This man became the boy's Erastes, literally lover, while the boy was his Eromenos, beloved. The exact nature of these relationships remains debated by scholars. Ancient sources, particularly Plutarch and Xenophon, describe them as having educational, mentoring, and protective functions. The Erastes was responsible for the boy's moral and military education. He trained him, advised him, protected him from excessive abuse by others, and was held personally accountable for the boy's behavior. If the boy showed cowardice or failed in training, the Erastes was punished alongside him. However, these relationships clearly had an erotic component that went beyond mentorship. Spartan poetry from the period, particularly fragments from poets like Alcman, contains explicitly homoerotic content that was associated with these pairings. The sexual aspect was seen not as shameful but as creating bonds of intense loyalty. Warriors would fight beside their former mentors and lovers, motivated not just by abstract duty, but by the visceral desire not to disappoint or lose the man beside them in the phalanx. This practice was distinct from Athenian pederasty in important ways. In Athens, such relationships were private affairs, often criticized and subject to social regulation. In Sparta, they were public, institutionalized, and mandatory. They were seen as essential to creating the emotional bonds that made the Spartan phalanx so devastatingly effective. A warrior, fighting to protect his lover, fought with ferocity that transcended self-preservation. By the late teenage years, boys in the Agoge were no longer children in any meaningful sense. They were physically hardened beyond what most modern people can imagine, capable of running 50 miles in a day, enduring exposure that would kill ordinary men, fighting with lethal skill. More importantly, they were psychologically transformed. They had learned to suppress pain, fear, and empathy. They had learned that individual desires meant nothing compared to collective needs. They had learned that weakness deserved death, that mercy was failure, that the only honorable life was one spent in service to Sparta. The blood ritual. All the daily brutality led to one culminating horror, the ceremony at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Artemis was goddess of the hunt, of wild nature, of transitions from childhood to adulthood. At her temple in Sparta, she demanded a blood offering that symbolized everything the Agoge represented. Cheese wheels were placed on her altar. Why cheese specifically is lost to history, but it likely had symbolic value related to pastoral life and sustenance. The boys' task appeared simple: run to the altar, seize the cheese, escape. But to reach the altar, they had to sprint through a corridor of irons armed with whips. These weren't symbolic whips or light tools. They were implements designed to cause severe pain, leather lashes often embedded with metal or bone fragments. As boys ran the gauntlet, the irons struck without mercy. The leather cut through skin, raising welts that would scar. The goal wasn't to stop the boys; they were expected to reach the altar, but to test how much pain they could endure without reaction. The true test came at the altar itself. Once a boy seized his cheese, he was required to stand there, exposed, while the whipping continued. He had to remain upright and silent. Any cry, any plea for mercy, any visible sign of pain was considered failure. Boys stood bleeding, their backs flayed open, their legs trembling with the effort of remaining standing, their faces fixed in masks of indifference that took every ounce of will to maintain. Plutarch's account is chilling. He describes boys whipped to death at the altar, dying without a sound, their faces serene, having proven their worth in their final moments. Whether this happened regularly or was rare enough to be notable, we cannot know for certain. But the fact that it could happen, that dying silently under the whip was considered an acceptable, even honorable outcome, reveals everything about what the Agoge had done to these boys' minds. Roman tourists later turned this ritual into entertainment. By the imperial period, long after Sparta's power had faded, wealthy Romans would travel to Sparta specifically to watch this spectacle of endurance. A theater was built around the altar to accommodate spectators. What had been a sacred rite of passage became a gladiatorial show, Spartan youth performing their ancestors' rituals for foreign gold. The transformation of this sacred horror into tourist entertainment perfectly symbolized Sparta's decline. By the time a young man emerged from the Agoge around age 20, he was no longer recognizably the child who had entered at 7. Physically, he was a weapon, conditioned to endure extremes of hardship, trained to kill with multiple weapons, hardened to pain beyond normal human limits. Psychologically, he was transformed even more profoundly. The Agoge had systematically destroyed normal human attachments, replacing them with absolute devotion to his unit and the state. He had learned that compassion was weakness, that individual survival meant nothing, that death in service to Sparta was the only meaningful life. But the state wasn't finished with him yet. One final test remained, one that would determine not just if he could fight, but if he could become what Sparta needed most: a killer without conscience, a guardian willing to commit murder in the dark. This was the Crypteia. The Crypteia? The final transformation, the Crypteia, was Sparta's darkest secret, rarely discussed even among Spartans themselves, a shadow organization that operated in the margins between law and murder. To understand it, you must first understand Sparta's fundamental terror, the Helots. The Helot system, foundation of fear at the foundation of Sparta's entire society, was a brutal system of enslavement unlike anything else in Greece. The Helots were not foreigners captured in war, as slaves typically were. They were Greeks, indigenous people of Messenia and Laconia, conquered by Sparta generations earlier and reduced to permanent servitude. They lived on Spartan-owned land, forced to hand over half their produce to their masters. They could not be bought or sold individually like chattel slaves, but they were bound to the land, passing from one generation to the next in endless servitude. The Helots outnumbered the Spartans catastrophically. Estimates vary, but most historians believe the ratio was somewhere between 7-1 and 10-1. In some periods, it may have been even higher. This demographic reality haunted every Spartan policy. They lived as a tiny warrior elite sitting atop a volcano of enslaved Greeks who had every reason to hate them and every motivation to rebel. The Spartan solution was systematic terrorism designed to keep the Helots psychologically broken. Helots were forced to wear dogskin caps, marking them as subhuman. They were made to drink unmixed wine until drunk, then paraded before Spartan youth as examples of the degradation of intoxication. They were required to sing mocking songs about themselves during festivals, publicly celebrating their own subjugation. Some were deliberately fattened and then beaten during public exhibitions to show the consequences of gluttony and softness. The Helots had no legal rights whatsoever. They could not own property, could not marry without permission, could not travel freely. A Spartan could beat or even kill a Helot without legal consequence. Their lives had no inherent value in Spartan law. They were resources like cattle or tools to be used and disposed of as needed. Yet despite this oppression, Helots were essential to Sparta's military system in a grimly ironic way. Helots served as armor-bearers and support troops in Spartan armies, carrying supplies, maintaining equipment, and sometimes even fighting as light infantry. They were expected to serve the very system that enslaved them, to risk their lives protecting their oppressors. This created a situation where the Spartans had to arm and train the very people they feared most, then trust them in battle while never trusting them at home. The economic contribution of the Helots was absolute. Every Spartiate citizen received a kleros, an allotment of land worked by Helots. The produce from this land supported the Spartiate and his family, allowing him to devote his entire life to military training without concerning himself with farming, trade, or any form of labor. Without Helot labor, the Agoge could not exist. Without the Agoge, Spartan military supremacy would collapse. The entire system rested on the backs of people who had every reason to destroy it. The Crypteia operations into this powder keg, the Spartans deployed the Crypteia, a secret police force composed of selected Agoge graduates, chosen for their ruthlessness, intelligence, and absolute loyalty. Each year, according to Plutarch and other sources, the most promising young Spartans were selected for this duty. They were given a simple mission: prevent Helot rebellion through preemptive assassination. The selected young men were sent into the countryside with minimal supplies: a knife, a cloak, some basic rations. They were ordered to hide during the day, avoiding detection, living rough in the wilderness. At night, they would emerge to hunt their assigned targets: Helots who showed signs of strength, leadership potential, or independent thinking. A Helot who was too strong, too intelligent, too respected among his peers was a threat. The Crypteia eliminated threats. This was political assassination dressed as military training. The young Spartans would observe Helot communities, identifying natural leaders, those who organized work details efficiently, who spoke eloquently, who others looked to for guidance. These men were marked for death not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had the capacity to lead a rebellion if given the chance. The Crypteia cut down any stalk that grew taller than the rest. The killings were carried out with calculated brutality. A Helot would be found dead in a field, throat cut, body left as a message, or he would simply disappear one night, never to be seen again, the uncertainty itself serving as terror. Sometimes the Crypteia would stage ambushes on roads, killing multiple Helots and making it appear to be banditry. The goal was not just elimination but intimidation, to make the Helots understand that any assertion of dignity or strength invited death. For the young Spartans, this was the final examination. They were being tested on whether they could kill not in the heat of battle, where adrenaline and survival instinct take over, but in cold blood. Could they stalk an unarmed man, watch him with his family, learn his routines, then murder him in the dark? Could they do this repeatedly, methodically, without remorse? If they could, they had proven that the Agoge had successfully erased their humanity and replaced it with absolute obedience to the state's needs. The annual declaration of war to make these murders legal, or at least avoid religious pollution. The Spartan ephors performed an annual ritual of stunning cynicism. At the beginning of each year, they formally declared war on the Helots. This wasn't metaphorical. It was an official act recorded in state documents, proclaimed publicly. Once war was declared, Helots were legally enemies of the state. Killing them wasn't murder, it was a military act. The religious pollution that normally came from killing another Greek was avoided because the victims were technically enemies killed in wartime. This legal fiction reveals something crucial about Spartan psychology. They understood that what they were doing was horrific. They felt the need to create elaborate justifications, to dress up systematic murder as legitimate warfare. Yet their solution wasn't to stop the murders but to create bureaucratic cover for them. The declaration of war made institutional what would otherwise be genocide, transforming mass murder into state policy. The declaration served another function. It maintained the Helots in a permanent state of legal vulnerability. Every Helot lived with the knowledge that, at any moment, for any reason, a Spartan could kill them with impunity. This wasn't paranoia, it was documented fact, announced publicly, renewed annually. The psychological impact of living under official death sentence, year after year, generation after generation, cannot be overstated. It was designed to break the spirit of an entire people, to make them internalize their own worthlessness. Helot resistance and rebellion. Despite the terror, the Helots resisted. Minor acts of defiance were constant, deliberate inefficiency, hidden sabotage, private maintenance of their own culture and identity. Helot women sang songs passed down through generations, songs of their people's history before conquest, keeping alive the memory of freedom. Helot men would gather in secret, away from Spartan eyes, to maintain bonds of community and mutual support. And occasionally, when Sparta showed weakness, the Helots rose in open rebellion. The most significant occurred after the devastating earthquake of 464 BCE. A massive quake struck Sparta, collapsing buildings and killing thousands. Estimates range from 20,000 to possibly even higher, though ancient numbers are notoriously unreliable. The earthquake killed a substantial portion of the Spartiate class, perhaps a quarter of all full citizens, and left the city in ruins. The Helots of Messenia saw their opportunity. They rose in coordinated rebellion, led by a man whose name is lost to history, but who organized a resistance that lasted nearly a decade. They fortified Mount Ithome, using the rugged terrain to their advantage, and from there launched raids and defended against Spartan assaults. Sparta, already weakened by the earthquake and unable to fully mobilize due to needing to maintain control over the remaining Helot population, struggled to suppress the rebellion. The conflict became a war of attrition. Sparta eventually called for help from other Greek states, including Athens, a decision they would later bitterly regret when Athenian assistance was withdrawn after political tensions emerged. The rebellion exposed the fundamental fragility of the Spartan system. Without overwhelming force to keep the Helots terrorized, without the numerical superiority needed to garrison every village and farm, Sparta's entire society teetered on the edge of collapse. Eventually, after years of fighting, Sparta managed to suppress the revolt, though the details of the final resolution are murky in ancient sources. Some Helots were apparently allowed to leave Messenia under truce, resettling elsewhere in Greece. Others were killed. Still others returned to servitude, but the message was clear. The system could be challenged, and it took every ounce of Spartan military power to maintain it. The earthquake and rebellion had lasting effects. Sparta became even more paranoid about internal security, even more brutal in its preemptive violence, even more dependent on the crypteia to eliminate potential leaders before they could organize resistance. The fear of Helot rebellion shaped Spartan foreign policy. They were often reluctant to campaign far from home or commit their full forces abroad because doing so left them vulnerable to internal uprising. This is the context in which the crypteia operated, not as simple bandits or military training exercise, but as essential instruments of state terror maintaining a system that was fundamentally unstable. Without the crypteia's annual culling of potential leaders, without the constant murder of anyone who might organize resistance, the Helots might have risen and overwhelmed their masters. The young Spartans hunting in the night weren't just proving their ruthlessness. They were providing a service the state literally could not survive without. By the time a crypteia member completed his service and returned to regular military life, he had crossed a threshold that most humans never approach. He had learned to kill not just in self-defense or battle frenzy, but methodically targeting specific individuals, planning their deaths, executing them in cold blood, and sleeping soundly afterward. The transformation was complete. The child taken from his mother at 7 had become exactly what Sparta needed. A perfect instrument of violence capable of any act the state required, limited only by orders, not by conscience. Full citizenship and marriage. The cycle continues. At age 30, having survived the Agoge, proven himself in battle, and potentially served in the crypteia, a Spartan finally achieved full citizenship. He could vote in the assembly, hold public office, and, most significantly, leave the barracks to establish a household. But this new freedom came with a familiar duty: reproduction. The state that had controlled his birth, his childhood, his education, now controlled his marriage. Spartan law required all citizens to marry and produce children. Remaining unmarried past 30 was not just socially unacceptable, it was a legal offense. The bachelor tax, a penalty levied on unmarried men, was the least of it. Unmarried men were excluded from public festivals, denied seats at games, and, most humiliating, subjected to the ritual of the gymnopaedia. During the gymnopaedia, a winter festival honoring Apollo, unmarried men were forced to march naked around the agora while married women sang mocking songs about their failure. Young men were not required to yield their seats or show respect to these men, inverting the normal deference shown to elders. The message was clear: personal choice about marriage was not actually a choice. Your body, your life, your genetic legacy all belonged to Sparta. The marriage ritual itself was designed to minimize emotional attachment while maximizing reproductive success. It began with a ritualized kidnapping. The groom, often acting with help from friends, would abduct his bride from her family home. This wasn't secret, everyone involved knew it was coming, but the ritual maintained the fiction of capture, perhaps echoing ancient marriage practices or simply reinforcing male dominance. The bride was immediately transformed. Her head was shaved completely, removing all feminine appearance. Some scholars suggest this was practical, preventing lice in the military-focused household. Others argue it was symbolic, temporarily making her resemble a young man to ease the groom's transition from the all-male environment of the barracks to heterosexual relations. The psychological implications are disturbing either way. She was dressed in men's clothing and sandals, further obscuring her femininity, and left alone in a dark room on a simple bed. The groom would come to her secretly after his evening meal in the Syssitia, having told his messmates he was stepping out briefly. He would consummate the marriage in darkness, never seeing his bride's face clearly, then return to the barracks before dawn to sleep among his fellow soldiers. This pattern continued for years. Even after official marriage, Spartan men did not establish households until age 30. They visited their wives for procreation, but maintained their primary residence in the communal barracks. Plutarch claims that some men fathered multiple children before ever seeing their wives in daylight. This is likely exaggeration, but even if partially true, it illustrates the radical separation between reproductive duty and emotional connection. The purpose was calculated: maintain the primacy of military bonds over marital bonds. A Spartan's true family was his Syssitia, his mess group, the men he trained with, ate with, fought beside. His wife was an essential but secondary relationship, important for producing the next generation, but never allowed to compete with his loyalty to his military unit. Love, if it developed, had to exist within these constraints. Romantic passion was fine as long as it didn't interfere with duty. Spartan women. Strength and subjugation. Spartan women occupied a paradoxical position, simultaneously more free and more constrained than women anywhere else in Greece. Unlike Athenian women who lived largely in seclusion, managing household affairs but rarely appearing in public, Spartan women moved freely through the city. They exercised publicly, often in minimal clothing that shocked visitors from other cities. They were educated, literate, capable of sophisticated conversation about poetry and politics. Most significantly, they controlled property. Spartan men were often away for extended periods on military campaigns. Women managed the kleroi, the land allotments worked by helots, making crucial agricultural and economic decisions. Over time, as war casualties mounted and inheritance laws concentrated wealth, women came to control an estimated 2/5 of all Spartan land. Some women became extraordinarily wealthy and powerful, though they still could not vote or hold office. This economic power gave Spartan women influence unimaginable in Athens or Thebes. They could speak their minds, challenge men publicly, and exercise considerable control over household decisions. The philosopher Aristotle, writing about Sparta, complained that women had too much power, that they lived licentiously, and that their influence corrupted Spartan society. His complaints reveal more about Athenian misogyny than Spartan reality, but they confirm that Spartan women were notably different from their counterparts elsewhere. Yet this freedom existed entirely within the framework of state ideology. Spartan women were strong, educated, and influential specifically because Sparta needed them to fulfill their role, producing and raising warriors. Their physical training wasn't for their own benefit, but to ensure healthy pregnancies and deliveries. Their education wasn't for personal enrichment, but to make them effective mothers who would instill proper values in children during their first 7 years. Their economic power wasn't recognition of gender equality, but practical necessity when men were constantly away at war. Spartan women internalized this ideology completely. They became its most fierce defenders. The famous stories of Spartan mothers telling sons to return with their shields or on them, of mothers killing sons who showed cowardice, of women celebrating the deaths of their sons in battle. These weren't invented by hostile sources. They were Spartan boasts, examples of proper feminine virtue according to their value system. Plutarch records numerous examples. A Spartan woman told her son was killed in battle, asked only, "Was the victory ours?" When told yes, she replied, "Then I accept his death gladly." Another woman, hearing 5 sons died in battle, interrupted the messenger. "That's not what I asked. Did we win?" A third woman killed her son with her own hands when he returned as the sole survivor of a defeat, saying he was no son of hers but a disgrace to Sparta. These stories may be partially apocryphal, but they reflect genuine Spartan values. Maternal love existed, but it was subordinate to patriotic duty. The ultimate honor for a Spartan woman was to be the mother of a warrior who died gloriously in battle. Tombstones, rare in Sparta, were typically reserved for men who died in war and women who died in childbirth. The 2 ways to die in service to the state. This equivalence was explicit. A woman's battlefield was the birthing bed, her heroism measured in sons produced and sacrificed for Sparta. The Syssitia, maintaining the bonds even after establishing households, Spartan men remained bound to their Syssitia, their mess groups, throughout their lives. Each Syssitia consisted of about 15 men who ate together daily. These weren't optional social clubs, they were state-mandated organizations essential to citizenship. A Spartan who could not contribute his required share of food to the Syssitia due to poverty lost his citizenship entirely, becoming a hypomaion, an inferior, stripped of political rights and social status. The meals themselves were deliberately plain. The famous black broth, made from pork, blood, vinegar, and salt, was so notoriously unpalatable that visitors from other cities joked that after tasting it, they understood why Spartans were so willing to die in battle. The food wasn't meant to be enjoyable. It was meant to maintain equality and simplicity, to prevent luxury from softening the warrior spirit. These daily meals served multiple functions beyond nutrition. They maintained the social bonds formed in the Agoge, keeping warriors connected to their unit for life. They reinforced hierarchy and discipline, with younger men serving older ones and following strict protocols. They provided forums for discussing military matters and city politics. Most importantly, they ensured that every Spartan remained embedded in the collective, never fully private, never solely focused on his individual household. A Spartan man's life thus remained split between 2 worlds, the military collective that owned his days and the household where he performed his reproductive duty at night. This division was enforced structurally and psychologically. To prioritize family over the Syssitia invited social censure. To show excessive affection for one's children suggested weakness. The ideal Spartan maintained emotional distance even from his own offspring, ready to sacrifice them without hesitation if the state required it. The peak, Spartan military dominance. For nearly 3 centuries, this brutal system produced exactly what it was designed to produce, the most effective military force in the Greek world. At the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, King Leonidas led 300 Spartans and several thousand allied Greeks against the might of Persia. When Xerxes demanded they surrender their weapons, Leonidas responded with the legendary laconic phrase, "Malon labe," come and take them. For 3 days, the Greeks held the narrow pass, with the Spartans forming the core of the defense. The Persian army, numbering possibly over 100,000, could not break through. The Spartans fought in perfect phalanx formation, their training making them essentially a single organism with hundreds of spear points. When one man fell, another stepped into his place instantly, without hesitation, the formation never wavering. Eventually, a Greek trader named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain path that allowed them to outflank the Greek position. Leonidas, realizing the situation was hopeless, dismissed most of the allies and chose to remain with his 300 Spartans and a few hundred Thespian and Theban volunteers. They fought to the last man, selling their lives dearly, killing thousands of Persians before being overwhelmed. The 300 became legendary, but what made them terrifying wasn't individual heroism, it was collective discipline. They died in formation, maintaining their shield wall even as they were surrounded and cut down. This wasn't the romantic last stand of myth. It was the inevitable outcome when men conditioned to never retreat met impossible odds. They literally couldn't run. The Agoge had made retreat psychologically impossible. Spartan military reputation reached its peak in the decades following the Persian Wars. At the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE, the Spartan contingent under Pausanias formed the anchor of the Greek line, their discipline decisive in defeating the Persian army. In the subsequent decades, Sparta became the acknowledged military leader of Greece. Other city-states sought Spartan generals to lead their armies. Enemies avoided engaging Spartan forces if at all possible. The Spartan phalanx was devastatingly effective because it operated on principles other Greek armies couldn't match. Every man in the formation had undergone identical training. Every man trusted the man beside him absolutely, knowing he had survived the same trials. Every man valued collective success over personal survival. The phalanx worked because it was composed not of individuals but of interchangeable parts in a machine. Traditional Greek warfare involved phalanx formations pushing against each other, with victory going to whichever side broke first. Sparta almost never broke. Their men had been beaten, starved, humiliated, and brutalized since age 7. The psychological pressure of battle was nothing compared to what they'd already endured. Where other armies might rout when casualties mounted, Spartans held their ground, dying where they stood rather than dishonoring themselves through retreat. This reputation became a weapon in itself. Cities would surrender at the approach of a Spartan army rather than face them in battle. Mercenaries would refuse contracts if it meant fighting against Spartans. The sight of red cloaks and lambda-marked shields advancing in perfect silence, spears lowered, was enough to break enemy morale before the first blow was struck. During the Peloponnesian War against Athens, Sparta's military superiority on land was unquestionable. Athenian strategy explicitly avoided land battles with Sparta, relying instead on naval power and fortifications. The Athenian general Pericles' entire strategy was based on the recognition that Athens could not defeat Sparta in direct combat. This acknowledgement from Athens, at the time the richest, most powerful, and most populous city-state in Greece, demonstrates how completely Sparta dominated the military sphere. The seeds of destruction, yet within this perfection lay hidden flaws that would ultimately prove fatal. 3 poisons worked slowly through the Spartan system, invisible at first, devastating in combination. Poison 1, demographic collapse. The first poison was mathematics. The eugenic selection that made Spartans superior made them rare. The population of full Spartiate citizens was never large, perhaps 8,000 to 9,000 at the peak in the early 5th century BCE. But this number declined steadily and catastrophically. By 371 BCE, at the Battle of Leuctra, there were fewer than 2,000 full citizens. By the time of Roman conquest, the number had fallen below 1,000. Multiple factors drove this decline. Infant exposure at the apothete, while probably affecting a relatively small percentage of births, still reduced the population. Warfare killed Spartans who could not be replaced, each death representing not just a lost soldier but 3 decades of investment and a carefully curated bloodline removed from the gene pool. Natural disasters like the devastating earthquake of 464 BCE killed thousands in moments. But the most insidious cause was economic. Over time, land ownership became concentrated in fewer hands through inheritance patterns and the impoverishment of some families. A Spartan who could not afford his Syssitia contributions lost his citizenship, becoming a hypomaean. These men still lived in Sparta, still had Spartan blood, but they were excluded from the citizen class, could not serve in the primary phalanx, and could not hold office. The very system designed to maintain equality created its own internal class divisions. The declining population meant Sparta could field fewer soldiers. A loss of 400 men at Leuctra, which would be replaceable for Athens or Thebes, was catastrophic for Sparta. They couldn't simply train more, the Agoge took decades, and they didn't have enough citizens producing children. They had optimized themselves into a corner, creating warriors so perfect they couldn't make enough of them to sustain their power. Some Spartans recognized the problem. King Agoge Roman IV in the 3rd century BCE attempted reforms to restore citizen numbers by redistributing land and extending citizenship to qualified perioikoi, free non-citizens. He was assassinated for his efforts. Later, King Cleomenes Roman III tried similar reforms and briefly restored Spartan military power, but his efforts ultimately failed. The system was too rigid to reform, and those benefiting from concentration of wealth resisted changes that would dilute their power. Poison 2. Inflexibility. The second poison was cognitive rigidity. The Agoge produced soldiers who could follow orders flawlessly but could not think creatively. Innovation required questioning, and questioning had been beaten out of them at age 7. Spartan military tactics were the same in 370 BCE as they had been in 480 BCE. Perfect execution of traditional phalanx warfare with no adaptation to changing conditions. Other Greek states innovated. Thebes developed the oblique phalanx, concentrating force on one wing while holding back the other. Athens experimented with combined arms tactics, coordinating cavalry, light infantry, and hoplites. Even smaller cities adapted their methods as warfare evolved. Sparta did what Sparta had always done, trusting that superior discipline would overcome any tactical disadvantage. This worked until it didn't. Spartan generals were tactically conservative, religiously adhering to traditional methods. They were brave, disciplined, and thoroughly predictable. Against enemies equally predictable, this was fine. Against creative opponents willing to try unorthodox tactics, it was fatal. The inflexibility extended beyond tactics to grand strategy. Sparta struggled to adapt to a changing geopolitical landscape. As Greek warfare shifted toward longer campaigns, sieges, and naval power, Sparta remained focused on short, decisive land battles. They never developed effective siege warfare capabilities. Their navy was always inferior to Athens, manned largely by helots and perioikoi rather than citizens. They couldn't project power beyond the Peloponnese effectively. Most critically, they couldn't adapt their internal system to address the demographic crisis. The solution was obvious. Expand citizenship, allow helots to earn freedom through military service, incorporate perioikoi fully into the citizen body. Other Greek states did exactly this, maintaining or growing their populations. Sparta couldn't or wouldn't make such changes. The system was sacred, ordained by the legendary Lycurgus, and to change it would be to admit it was flawed. So they maintained it unchanged even as it killed them. Poison 3, wealth and corruption. The third poison came with victory. When Sparta defeated Athens in 404 BCE, ending the Peloponnesian War, Persian gold flooded into the city as payment for Spartan cooperation against Athens. Wealth, the thing Lycurgus had supposedly banned, suddenly corrupted everything. The legendary Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus had designed a system around enforced equality. Spartans were supposed to be identical in their poverty, distinguished only by virtue and valor. They used iron bars as currency, deliberately made worthless outside Sparta to prevent accumulation of wealth. Private luxury was forbidden, but Persian silver and gold could not be kept out, and once it entered, it transformed Spartan society. Some Spartans became wealthy. They bought land from impoverished citizens. They lived in larger houses, ate better food, wore finer clothes. The equality that had bound them together dissolved. The syssitia, once mandatory communal meals of simple fare where all ate equally, became harder to maintain as some could afford better and resented contributing to communal mediocrity. Corruption entered Spartan politics. Generals and officials who could be bribed, who made decisions based on personal gain rather than state interest. The legendary incorruptibility of Spartans became a joke. Other Greeks noted the transformation with bitter irony. The Spartans had conquered Athens, but had been conquered by Athenian luxury and Persian gold. Wealthy Spartans found ways to avoid the harshest aspects of military life. They hired substitutes for some duties. They secured comfortable assignments rather than dangerous campaigns. The principle that every Spartiate was first and foremost a warrior, that wealth and privilege meant nothing compared to military service, crumbled. When some were more equal than others, when wealth could buy exemptions, the bonds of shared suffering that held the system together weakened. The younger generation, born into this new reality, didn't experience the same harsh equality their fathers had. They grew up seeing wealth as desirable, seeing ways around the traditional strictures, seeing their elders failing to live up to Spartan ideals. The ideology that sustained the system required universal belief and participation. Once that cracked, the entire edifice began to collapse. The fall, Leuctra and beyond. All three poisons converged at Leuctra in 371 BCE. Theban general Epaminondas faced a Spartan army under King Cleombrotus. The Spartans expected traditional phalanx warfare. Both armies would form lines, advance, push until one side broke. They had won this way for centuries. Their superior discipline always prevailed. Epaminondas did something unprecedented. He concentrated his left wing 50 men deep, far deeper than the standard 8 to 12 ranks, creating an armored battering ram. He refused his right wing, holding it back from engagement. Then he advanced his massed left wing directly at the Spartan right, where King Cleombrotus and the royal guard stood, the position of honor traditionally held by Sparta's elite. The Spartans maintained their formation perfectly, doing exactly what they had been trained to do, but tactical perfection couldn't overcome mathematical reality. The massed Theban column crashed into the Spartan line with overwhelming force. The Spartans held briefly, fighting with desperate courage, but were pushed back, their formation disrupted. King Cleombrotus was killed, the first Spartan king to die in battle since Leonidas at Thermopylae nearly 110 years earlier. The Spartan army broke. They retreated in disorder, abandoning the field, leaving their dead behind, an act of profound dishonor in Greek culture. 400 Spartiates died at Leuctra along with allied troops. For Sparta, this loss was catastrophic. 400 dead represented roughly a fifth of their entire remaining citizen body. These weren't just soldiers, they were irreplaceable products of the Agoge men who had survived 30 years of conditioning and battle. They couldn't be replaced. But the military defeat, devastating as it was, wasn't the end. Epaminondas followed up by invading the Peloponnese, something previously considered impossible. He marched into Spartan territory, freed the Helots of Messenia, and helped establish them as an independent state with a fortified city at Messene. This blow struck at Sparta's foundation. Without Messenian Helots and the land they worked, Sparta lost roughly half its agricultural base. The kleroi that supported Spartiate citizens suddenly produced nothing. The economic system that had allowed Spartans to devote their lives to warfare collapsed. Spartans who had never worked a field were suddenly forced to farm their own land or starve. The Agoge, which required helot labor to function, became unsustainable. Sparta's power evaporated almost overnight. They remained a military force, still dangerous, still disciplined, but no longer dominant. Other cities were no longer afraid. The myth of Spartan invincibility was shattered, and with it went the psychological weapon that had been as important as their spears. In subsequent decades, Sparta declined into regional irrelevance, unable to field the armies that had once dominated Greece, unable to reform a system that was killing them, unable to adapt to a world that had moved beyond them. By the time Rome conquered Greece in the 2nd century BCE, Sparta was a provincial backwater trading on former glory. Roman tourists came to see the ruins of the society that had terrified the ancient world. The ritual whipping at Artemis Orthia continued, but now as a spectacle for foreign entertainment. A theater was built to accommodate spectators who paid to watch young Spartans undergo flogging, a sacred rite degraded into gladiatorial show. The perfect warriors had become performers, actors in a theme park version of their ancestors' reality. The legacy and the warning. The story of Sparta forces uncomfortable questions. What is the price of perfection? What is lost when efficiency becomes the only value? What happens to humanity when the state gains total control over reproduction, childhood, and identity? Sparta proved that humans can be conditioned to extraordinary extremes. They demonstrated that with sufficient time, control, and ruthlessness, you can create soldiers who literally cannot break, who will die in formation rather than retreat, who value collective success over individual survival absolutely. They showed what total militarization of society can achieve. They also proved that such achievement is unsustainable. The very perfection they sought contained its own destruction. The system that made them invincible made them unable to adapt. The discipline that united them made them unable to think creatively. The equality that bonded them made them unable to address wealth concentration. The eugenics that strengthened them made them demographically fragile. Modern totalitarian regimes have looked to Sparta as inspiration. Nazi Germany explicitly modeled aspects of its ideology on Spartan practices. The emphasis on breeding superior humans, the subordination of individual to state, the cult of military valor, the elimination of defective infants. This appropriation further darkens Sparta's legacy. The 20th century showed us what happens when Spartan logic is industrialized, when eugenics becomes systematic, when the apothecary becomes Auschwitz. Yet we should be careful not to simply dismiss Sparta as an ancient aberration with no modern relevance. Elements of Spartan thinking persist in contemporary societies. Emphasis on athletic excellence and competition, valorization of military service, debates about genetic engineering and designer babies, arguments about state control over reproduction and child rearing. The questions Sparta forces us to confront remain urgent. How much control should the collective have over the individual? What is the proper balance between personal freedom and social duty? When does the pursuit of excellence become dehumanizing? Sparta's greatest achievement was also its greatest failure. They succeeded completely in their goal, creating the perfect warrior, and in doing so proved that perfection is incompatible with survival. A society of weapons is not a society at all. It's a machine, and like all machines, it can only perform its designed function. When circumstances change, when new challenges arise that require different responses, the machine simply breaks down. The Spartans wanted to prove that humans could be perfected through selective breeding and total conditioning. They proved instead that the attempt to perfect humanity destroys the very qualities that make survival possible. Adaptability, creativity, compassion, the ability to question and change course when necessary. They eliminated weakness and discovered too late that what they called weakness was actually resilience in disguise. Conclusion: the price of perfection. Today, the ruins of Sparta lie scattered across a quiet valley in southern Greece. Tourists occasionally stop, mostly to see the Roman-era theater where floggings were performed for entertainment. There's a small monument, a statue of Leonidas, some excavated foundations. Most visitors spend an hour or two, then move on to more impressive sites. Athens has the Parthenon, Delphi has its sanctuary, Olympia has its stadium, Sparta has rubble and memories. This emptiness is itself a kind of monument. Sparta left almost no art, no literature, no philosophy, no architecture of note. They built no great temples, wrote no plays, composed no lasting music. The society that dominated Greece for 3 centuries left almost nothing behind except weapons and warnings. In Athens, you can still read the plays of Sophocles, study the philosophy of Plato, admire the sculptures of Phidias. Spartan culture produced spears and shields, now rusted to dust. The contrast is instructive. Athens valued the life of the mind alongside military strength. They created art, philosophy, drama, democracy, imperfect achievements, all but lasting ones. Their defeats in battle didn't end their civilization because their civilization wasn't only military. When Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, they rebuilt, continued creating, remained culturally dominant even under Spartan political control. When Sparta lost at Leuctra, they had nothing to fall back on. Military power was their only achievement, and without it, they were nothing. This is the fundamental lesson. Societies that value only one thing, no matter how perfectly they achieve it, are fragile. Specialization taken to extremes becomes vulnerability. Sparta optimized for war so completely that they became incapable of peace. They created men who could not be defeated in battle, but who could not adapt when warfare changed. They built a machine so perfect at its function that it could do nothing else. The human cost was incalculable. Think of the tens of thousands of infants left on Mount Taygetus over 3 centuries, killed for failing to meet arbitrary standards of physical perfection. Think of the generations of children ripped from their families at 7, brutalized through adolescence, transformed into instruments of violence. Think of the helots living under perpetual death sentence, terrorized by nighttime assassins, reduced to subhuman status to support a warrior elite. Think of the mothers who celebrated their sons' deaths, who killed sons who survived defeat, who were conditioned to suppress every maternal instinct in service to the state. Count the cost in lives destroyed, in human potential wasted, in suffering deliberately inflicted. Then look at what it purchased: 3 centuries of military dominance followed by precipitous decline into irrelevance. Was it worth it? The Spartans would have said yes. They valued glory above happiness, military excellence above human flourishing, collective strength above individual welfare. By their own standards, they succeeded magnificently, but we don't have to accept their standards. We can look at Sparta and recognize it for what it was: a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing perfection at the expense of humanity. They proved that with sufficient ruthlessness, humans can be shaped into nearly anything. They also proved that such shaping comes at a cost that ultimately destroys what it claims to preserve. Modern genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, transhumanism, all raise similar questions. What are we willing to sacrifice to create superior humans? How much control should society exercise over reproduction? When does optimization become dehumanization? Sparta attempted human genetic engineering through selective breeding and social conditioning. They achieved remarkable results and paid a devastating price. As we develop technologies that make their crude methods seem primitive, we should remember what happened when an ancient society decided that creating perfect warriors justified any means necessary. The Spartans set out to create men who were more than human warriors, who transcended ordinary limitations of fear, pain, and mortality. They ended up creating men who were less than human, who had been so thoroughly conditioned that they lost the flexibility, creativity, and compassion necessary for survival in a changing world. They proved that you can condition away weakness, but in doing so, you also condition away the adaptability that true strength requires. In the end, Sparta's story is a tragedy in the classical sense. They had everything they thought they needed: the best warriors, the most rigorous training, the most disciplined society, the most feared military in Greece. They achieved their goals completely, and that achievement led inevitably to their destruction. Not because they failed at what they attempted, but because what they attempted was fundamentally flawed. The last Spartans, living under Roman rule, performing their ancestors' rituals for tourist gold, must have understood this on some level. They were living proof that military excellence alone doesn't ensure survival, that a society built entirely on martial values has no foundation when those values become obsolete, that perfection is not survivable because perfection cannot adapt. The question Sparta leaves us with is not, how did they create such perfect warriors? We know how, through a system of control, conditioning, and cruelty unmatched in the ancient world. The real question is, what did they lose in the process? The answer lies in their ruins, in the empty valley where their city stood, in the genetic bottleneck they created, in the demographic collapse they couldn't prevent, in the helots they terrorized until those helots were freed and Sparta starved. In the inflexible tactics that couldn't adapt to innovation, in the wealth that corrupted their iron discipline, in the fall of their king at Leuctra, in the silence where their culture should have been. They lost everything that makes life worth living. They lost art, love, family, individual identity, personal choice, intellectual freedom, the capacity for change. They created a society of perfect warriors who had nothing worth fighting for except the abstract glory of Sparta itself. And when that glory faded, when the battles were lost and the reputation shattered, they discovered they had nothing left. The perfect weapon they created had no purpose outside warfare, and when warfare moved beyond them, they became obsolete. This is the price of perfection. Everything humans sacrificed on the altar of a single virtue taken to its absolute extreme. This is the cost of creating the perfect warrior, a society that can produce nothing else, that has no other value, that cannot survive its own success. This is what happens when optimization becomes the only goal. You get 300 years of dominance, warriors who become legends, a reputation that echoes through millennia, and then extinction. You get Sparta. And then you lose it. The ruins remain as a warning. In our age of genetic engineering, cognitive enhancement, optimization of human potential, we face similar temptations. We have technologies the Spartans couldn't dream of, the ability to modify genes, enhance cognition, extend lifespans, create designer babies with selected traits. We can achieve in a laboratory what they attempted through centuries of selective breeding and brutal conditioning. But should we? Sparta suggests an answer. They showed us what happens when a society decides that creating superior humans justifies any cost, when the pursuit of perfection overrides concern for humanity, when optimization becomes the highest value. They achieved their goal and destroyed themselves in the process. Perhaps the weakness they sought to eliminate, compassion, doubt, love, individual choice, the messy inefficiency of human emotion and connection. Perhaps these aren't bugs to be fixed but features that make survival possible. Perhaps imperfection is not a flaw to be corrected but a necessary condition of adaptability. Perhaps the cost of creating perfect humans is simply too high, not in money or effort, but in what must be sacrificed to achieve it. Sparta paid that cost. They paid it with the bodies of infants on mountainsides, with the souls of children broken in the Agoge, with the blood of helots murdered in darkness, with the emotional bonds severed by state decree, with the demographic collapse they couldn't prevent, with the inflexibility that made them vulnerable, with the corruption that dissolved their unity, and finally with their civilization itself. That is the price of perfection. That is the cost of creating the perfect warrior. That is what happens when a society decides that military excellence matters more than humanity itself. Sparta stands as history's most complete answer to the question, what if we optimized human society purely for war? The answer is clear. You get temporary power at the cost of permanent humanity. You get excellence that cannot endure. You get strength that becomes weakness. You get perfection that cannot survive. You get 300 men who held Thermopylae and became immortal, but you get a system that could not create enough of them, could not adapt when the world changed, could not survive its own success. You get Sparta. And then you lose it. And perhaps, in the end, That is the most important lesson of all. That the pursuit of perfection is itself imperfect, that human flourishing requires embracing our weaknesses alongside our strengths, that a society worth preserving must value more than military power. That the qualities which seem strongest in the moment may be fatal in the long run. The Spartans were right about one thing: they created warriors who could not be broken. They were wrong about what that meant. Strength that cannot bend eventually shatters. Perfection that cannot adapt eventually becomes obsolete. Warriors who cannot change eventually become irrelevant. The unbreakable sword eventually meets the force that breaks it, not through superior strength, but through superior flexibility. Sparta's legacy is not their 300 at Thermopylae, glorious as that last stand was. Their legacy is the ruins of their city, the silence of their culture, the extinction of their way of life. Their legacy is the proof that perfection is a lie, that optimization has limits, that the attempt to create superior humans through control and conditioning ultimately fails. Their legacy is a warning carved in stone and written in blood. This is what happens when you sacrifice everything human in pursuit of something superhuman. You get neither. You get monsters who call themselves perfect, machines that call themselves men, and eventually ruins that once were a civilization. The monument to Leonidas still stands in that quiet valley. Tourists take photos, read the plaque about the 300 and move on. Few understand what they're really looking at. Not a memorial to glory, but a gravestone for an entire way of life, a warning from the past about the dangers of the future, a reminder that some prices are too high to pay no matter how appealing the prize might seem. Sparta tried to create heaven on earth, a society of perfect warriors living in perfect order, achieving perfect victory. They succeeded in their own terms. And in doing so, they created something closer to hell. A system that devoured its children, terrorized its servants, eliminated its weak, hardened its strong until they were brittle, and ultimately consumed itself. This is the story of Sparta, not a triumph to be celebrated, but a tragedy to be learned from, not a model to be emulated, but a mistake to be avoided. Not proof that humans can be perfected, but proof that the attempt to perfect humanity destroys the very thing being perfected. Not a story of strength, but of fragility. Not a story of success, but of failure. Not a story of what we should become, but a warning about what we must never allow ourselves to become. The perfect warrior is a myth. Sparta spent 3 centuries proving it was possible to approach that myth, to come closer than any society before or since. And in achieving that approach, they proved conclusively that the myth should remain a myth, that perfection is incompatible with humanity, that the cost of excellence taken to its absolute extreme is existence itself. 300 Spartans held the pass at Thermopylae and became legends. But the system that created those 300 was itself destroyed by its own perfection, consumed by its own success, defeated not by external enemies but by internal contradictions that were present from the beginning. The machine that manufactured warriors could not manufacture what it needed most: the ability to change, to adapt, to survive in a world that would not stand still. And so Sparta fell. Not with glory, not in one dramatic last stand, but slowly, grinding to a halt as its perfect parts wore out and could not be replaced, as its rigid structure cracked under changing pressures, as its specialized function became obsolete. The perfect machine broke down, and there was no one left who knew how to fix it, because fixing it would have required changing it, and change was the one thing the machine was designed never to do. This is the final lesson, the ultimate warning. Perfection is the enemy of survival. Optimization is the enemy of adaptation. Strength that cannot bend is weakness in disguise. And the attempt to create perfect humans through total control, selective breeding, brutal conditioning, and systematic elimination of weakness does not create superior beings. It creates fragile ones specialized to the point of vulnerability, optimized for conditions that will inevitably change, perfect for a world that no longer exists. Sparta is gone. The perfect warriors are dust. The unbreakable system broke. The ideal society collapsed. And we are left with ruins, warnings, and the question: Will we learn the lesson, or will we repeat the mistake? Will we recognize the limits of perfection, or will we pursue it until we too become ruins in a quiet valley, monuments to the folly of trying to make humans into something more than human, only to discover we made them into something far less? The answer depends on whether we understand what Sparta truly was, not an ideal to aspire to, but a dead end to avoid. Not proof that humans can be perfected, but proof that they shouldn't be. Not a success story with a sad ending, but a cautionary tale from beginning to end. The 300 at Thermopylae were magnificent. The system that created them was monstrous. And the fact that the system worked, that it achieved its goals, that it created exactly what it set out to create is not a defense, it is an indictment. Sparta stands as proof that you can achieve perfection and lose everything in the process. That is their legacy. That is their warning. That is what they have to teach us if we are wise enough to listen. The perfect warrior is possible. The cost is civilization itself. Is that a price worth paying? Sparta answered yes. History answered differently. The ruins remain. The lesson remains. The choice now is ours.